Okay, welcome everybody to the session, Becoming More Sober with IM Tools and Approaches, the Avenues to Explore for Aid Actors. I'm Linda Raftree, and I organize a community practice called MERL Tech, which looks at the role of technology in monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning, and also the role of evaluation of technology in development and humanitarian programs. And I also work quite a lot on data protection and privacy with organizations in development and humanitarian spaces, and on child safeguarding, especially in the digital world. So today, we're going to talk about this idea of being more sober with information management. And the first question that we have for you all here in the room and online, before I introduce our panelists today, is really, what does being sober with data mean to you? So we have a QR code that should be going up on the screen. And we'd love for you to grab that QR code and, in a very few words, what does this concept of being sober with information management mean to you? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to go to the website at WooClap. Again, the question is, what does being sober with data or sober with information management mean to you? Looks like people are potentially typing, getting on. Okay, great. We should have some answers coming in. Amazing. Okay, they're very, very small. Thinking before clicking, avoiding duplication, doing more with less. Very, very tiny. Collecting and managing only relevant data. Yeah, kind of like this idea of data minimization. That's fantastic. See the other ones we've got here. Avoid irrelevant data. And a few other really great points up there. Not wasting resources, taking only useful data for a specific project. Great. I think that's everything that we're thinking about. We're going to hear from our panelists in a minute on what they think being sober with data means. But first, I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves. So I will start off with you, Melissa. What are you working on, and how does it relate to being sober with data?
So, welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Al-Hamouche, and I work for the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, but also with the Netherlands Red Cross, specifically the data team called 510. And my role is really about data and digital literacy. So I really focus on trying to engage people within the Red Cross, Red Crescent communities on improving their data culture within their organizations and doing it in an engaging way through data literacy, because sometimes trainings can get a bit too technical and lose the interest of people. So I try to really focus on the end user within the organizations and see how we can work together to make sure that these messages come across the entire organization and don't get stuck in one team or department.
Thank you. And we'll go from there to Simon Cardon.
Hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Simon Cardon, sustainable digital expert, accredited by the Institute of Sustainable. It's a Sustainable Digital European Institute. Also the founder and CEO of GreenWeb. We are specialized in sustainable IT solutions and digital forest. We do green hosting. Currently, we are working on three specific things. The first one is IT carbon measurement. The second thing is eco design for website. And the third thing is about green hosting.
Great, thank you, Simon. And lastly, we're going to hear from Shadrach Roberts, who is our online speaker today. Shadrach, what are you working on? What are you doing that's related to data and sobriety?
Hi, Linda. Thanks very much for having me. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Shadrach Roberts. I've been working at the intersection of data, technology, and humanitarian affairs for about 10 years. And while I started out as an analyst and someone who implemented ICT for D or T for D programming, I now work at Mercy Corps, and the focus is very much on responsible data. So I'm the data protection specialist, or the data protection specialist at Mercy Corps, where we are working on some of the same issues that Melissa talked about, digital literacy, trying to become more sober with our data and our approaches to it.
Great, thanks. And while you are up there on screen, Shadrach, what do you think it means to be sober with data? We've heard a little bit from what people in the room and other people online are thinking, but what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I find the use of the word sober very interesting. And I've tried to really reflect on that specifically a little bit. So for me, I take this as being able to see your situation very clearly. Someone who isn't sober isn't really seeing the world around them clearly. They're kind of seeing through a haze of whatever it is they're addicted to. So I very much like the idea about being able to sort of maybe face problems that you have in a clear way, and to be able to maybe not be afraid of those or hide from those by using some sort of mediating substance or something else, but to just try and sort of accept things as they are and improve them.
Super interesting. We're going to come back out to the audience in a minute and ask a few of you if you would like to share more about your thoughts on what being sober with data means. So a couple of you get some ideas ready, but we're going to hand back over to Simone. What do you think being sober with data means?
I think being sober with data is like making the use of data more sustainable, like the way we are thinking it in the present, but also for the future. And to replace the human in the middle of the organization. So, yeah, that's my point of view.
Thanks. And Melissa?
For me, it's really about understanding what the data is, how you can use it, and being able to clearly identify its purpose and its need. There's a lot of data sources out there that we can just keep collecting and collecting. So really reflecting back, taking a step back, and really identifying the purpose of what we intend to do, and having that in mind, also minimizing the amount of data that is actually being collected to meet the actual purpose of it. So this is kind of my reflection of what being sober with data is really about.
And now's the time. Anybody out who's sitting with us in the audience today want to give some additional thoughts around this idea of data sobriety?
Maybe I'll start also because I wrote the title of the session, and I'm realizing that maybe the sobriety term is much more used in French and in the Francophone world and in the Anglophone world, and I'm sort of seeing that from the reactions from our Anglophone speakers, which is very interesting. But maybe just from my point of view, to say that the rationalization side is the most important. And not only, obviously, just collecting what one needs, but also what one is in a capacity to analyze. Because I really feel sometimes that a lot of organizations are collecting because they do need that data, but then they just don't have the resources to actually analyze it at the end. Anybody else? Or from our online participants, don't hesitate. Could somebody pass the mic to Nolan?
Hello, I'm Nolan, CartONG volunteer. I think also with the emergence of open data, everything, it's really important to check if there are some accessible data existing, and to make sure that we really use it for the purpose that we are thinking about. And really try to use the more as possible the existing data in the market.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. So to use data that we're collecting for specific purposes, and that came out in some of the comments up there as well. Any other thoughts from folks in the room? Good. Okay. Nobody online? No? Okay. So Shadrach and I were talking about this a little bit and thinking about if data and technology are seen almost as an addiction, and this kind of lack of control of being able to collect more and more data, to go online all the time, to get as much, use as much technology as we can. And we were really thinking of it, I guess, from our English-speaking perspective, as almost something that was almost a harmful type of addiction, and that. In our status of trying to be more sober about our data was maybe being a little more restrained, maybe thinking more clearly about when is the time to collect data, about how much we should be collecting data. In the same way you might think of how many drinks should I have today, or something like that. So we were really thinking of this tendency that we have to really kind of overdo it with data, and not restrain ourselves, and not be more sober, more thoughtful, and more restricted. So that's why we found the title of the session to be quite interesting, because we feel like that really is a problem, or at least the two of us felt like that's really a problem in our sector, and potentially in the world in general, with the overuse of technology, which, as we heard this morning, really leads to environmental challenges that haven't been thought through fully, and also all types of risks and harms that can also be produced if we're not careful with how we collect and use our data. So we've heard about information sobriety a little bit, and I'm going to turn us to this question of how has this idea of being more reserved or being more careful with how we use data and technology changed over the last decade. I'm going to start off with Shadrach, because we also, when we were planning for the session, had an interesting conversation about both of us were somewhat involved back in where we feel like a turning point in the technology sector was in the ICT for D space, was with the Haiti earthquakes. And that's when we really started to see this rush of new technologies coming into the humanitarian space, especially with SMS messaging back in 2010. So Shadrach, what's the kind of historical arc from 2010 up to now, over the last 10, 12 years? How have people's sort of attitudes towards technology changed, and how have you seen a more sober, maybe, approach to the way technology and data is being used in the sector?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I think it's a very interesting question, and I can sketch out a little bit that historical arc. Certainly for myself and the colleagues I work closely with, some of this will certainly be very familiar to you. I want to be clear that I don't speak for the whole sector, but one of the things that I felt at the time, especially in the late 2000s and 2010, as a marker, a really important time marker, as you pointed out, was that there was this confluence of events where you had a lot of volunteers in a disaster. That's not new. That's been around for a long, long time. But you also had technology getting to a point where it was much easier for volunteers to create data, to make data, to help process data. You saw the rise of crowdsourcing. There were all kinds of things that were happening with OpenStreetMap, the OpenStreetMap community. Companies were starting to put out a lot of data as well, because Haiti was an earthquake, and the sky was relatively clear. It wasn't like flood or raining. There was a lot of satellite imagery available, so that got pushed out. So you had all these things happening at once. As you very rightfully pointed out, you had the rise of SMS, you had greater cell phone penetration. So there was all these things coming together at once. There was, information management was being more important in organizations. You had lots of volunteerism that was moving online. You had a lot of technology available. And I think one of the things that came out of that, the creation of groups like Crisis Mappers, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, certainly many others. I want to acknowledge the gentleman in the audience who works volunteer for CartONG. That's fantastic. We really appreciate your effort and your volunteering to help with data in humanitarian space. Was that a lot of the people who sort of started these movements felt like the humanitarian sector wasn't using data enough. It wasn't listening to local populations or the quote unquote beneficiaries, the people who were supposed to benefit from humanitarian intervention, that there wasn't a lot of data-driven decision making that was happening. So there was a push from those of us who were involved in that space to try and improve capacity of organizations to not only collect and use data, but also for data from volunteers, data from local communities to be pulled into that decision-making process. That was a big effort. And from my perspective, as someone who has worked both in very large donor organizations, such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, large intergovernmental, I've done some contract work for the UN. I work for big NGOs. Mercy Corps is a big international non-governmental organization. Is for the most part, throughout all of those organizations over the last 10 years, that the idea of data really more often than not gets sort of, it's used to talk about transparency a little bit, not as much as it used to be, and mostly around logistics. And it really has become a discourse of improving efficiency and being able to monitor or evaluate better. And that we still don't have a lot of, we're only now really finally starting to have a bigger conversations about responsible data. You know, someone like yourself has been talking about this for quite a long time, but I think you're in the minority, Linda. And if you look just in the last year at, you know, phishing attacks at USAID, of course, the tremendous mishandling of refugee data by UNHCR, the Rohingya refugees. ICRC was hacked recently. I must say that ICRC did a fantastic job in responding to that hack. But you see, you know, so participant data being exposed. I feel like the overall arc was that we pushed really hard to like get data into the humanitarian conversation, but then it's almost like we didn't follow through. We didn't keep thinking about the risks that might be associated with it. We didn't think about the digital divide. We didn't think about a lot of these things that maybe we could have thought of at the beginning. So that's my experience in the last 10 years in 4 minutes.
It's almost like be careful what you wish for, and we were maybe too successful in some cases in, you know, habilitating all this data collection and technology use back in the day. So, Melissa, what are some of the shifts that you've seen in your time over the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, exactly. So for myself specifically, and specifically my time within the humanitarian sector, I really saw a shift in digitalization, so moving away from paper-based to all these digital tools that are now helping us become faster, more efficient, and less prone to errors, because I can 100% testify I've had to redo so many things just due to manual errors. As we're all humans, we make mistakes, and it happens. So that was really the shift that I was able to see within the humanitarian sector specifically. But with digitalization, I was also prone to the risks that came with it. Also really touching upon what Shadrach was saying, there's so many different data breaches. Our data is accessible to almost everyone. How many of us in the room really go into managing our cookies with all the browsers that we open? So our data is really out there, and there's a lot of risk that comes with this digitalization. But I am seeing now more the conversation on data protection, data security, becoming more at the forefront of any project and program that we're working on, specifically within the Federation. As we work with 192 national societies, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, you really need to be discussing data protection guidelines and making sure that these organizations also have an understanding that it doesn't only affect them at an organization level, but it also affects the community that they're serving and the beneficiaries. So I do see the shift in conversation to really have protection at the forefront of it, but yeah, we always run the risk of having technologies that might not be safe. And it's really about asking that question, is it safe to use? Are we running the risk of just being faster and being more efficient to respond to an emergency? Or are we going to say, no, we're not going to use this technology, but really acknowledge the risk that it might have on the communities, but also at a later stage on the organization itself?
So I think you brought up some of the short and medium-term risks, and I think, Simone, you're thinking about the medium and long-term. If we think of climate change as long-term these days, maybe it's not even long-term anymore, but we used to think of digital as being more sustainable, and I'm thinking about, I still get emails that say, please think of the environment, don't print out this email. But it feels like that perspective is starting to shift a little bit too in terms of sustainability and technology, and I think that's some of the things that you're working on.
Yes, definitely. Actually, 10 years ago, we were digitalizing the world to make it more sustainable, to make it greener. And now we try to make more sustainable what was supposed to be sustainable before. So we had the IT for green, and now we worked on green IT. So the thing is, clearly, we didn't know where we were going ahead. So I really think that making visible the invisible is the key to get awareness about this situation. Awareness makes us able to take the right decision and to go ahead on the right action. Yeah, this is really my point of view, because we are now working on both of them. It means IT for green, so how IT help to make the world greener, and green IT, how to green the IT, the technologies. We really need to have this both point of view, because sometimes we can do both, sometimes we can do one of them. So that's important to get it on inside the head.
Excellent. And we want to also, again, go back out to folks who are in the room or online. We've talked about some different shifts from our own perspectives that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, and I'm curious what other shifts people have seen in terms of data, in terms of technology, in terms of thinking about data and technology in the humanitarian space or in the development space. Does anybody want to share any thoughts on what have you seen shifting and changing?
Hi, my name is Desiree. I work for HCAI. We are auditors in the humanitarian sector, and I'd like to change perspective away from digitalization and rather back to, we heard it in the beginning, back to paper. So with this entire COVID situation, we continued our audits, but we went much more remote. We managed to have discussions with communities remotely, over WhatsApp, over Skype, whatever. And it worked. I mean, it does. But nothing can ever replace personal contact. All the auditor can perceive through observation, through having coffee with someone, or just sitting in a car, going somewhere. I think from our point of view, we need both. Thank you.
Any more thoughts? I think one thing, I definitely agree that that the human contact, I mean, just even being at this conference has been wonderful because it's not all of us are online. Sorry, Shadrach. But most of us in the room are in the room, except Shadrach is in the room but online. But yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that because it's really one of my main topic, talking about phygital. So we were talking about digitalization and the physical world, and now we really see that we are living in both of them, and we need to have a coffee, to get in touch with someone, to do what we have to do as human maybe, and we need some digital tools to keep connecting maybe to, but the phygital concept is really interesting to illustrate what you were talking about.
I remember reading similarly an assessment about the use of SMS messages for research and for doing surveys, and I believe one of the findings was that SMS performed the best at reminding people that they had to go to a face-to-face interview. And so that was the best purpose for SMS at that point, was that it was very effective in giving you a reminder for something, but it wasn't very effective in doing a really high-quality SMS survey. So I think thinking about technology in different ways, exactly what you're saying is it phygital? Phygital. I love that term. Phygital, everybody. You heard it here first, probably. I did. Another thing I think was interesting is, I think back in the 2010s, we thought that all these digital tools were going to improve democratization and that they were all being developed for communities. And I think that in many cases, they're actually much better at enabling, as we've said here, sort of the efficiencies, the effectiveness of organizations. It's more of like a business to business or a humanitarian to humanitarian type of a tool, and not as effective at really fomenting and fostering community voices. And so thinking about that too, and when we think about how we're using these tools. We're going to shift gears just a little bit now. I think some of the reason that our tools haven't been that great at improving community voice and community participation is because we still have pretty big issues with the digital divide. So Melissa, you had quite a lot to say about the digital divide, so I'm going to hand back over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, exactly. Really, to go back to your last point is the digital tech that sometimes are being used or implemented or promoted are really for business to business or humanitarian to humanitarian, and a lot of the times they're not really developed thinking about the community itself. Of course, some of these tools need to be used by the organization and they're not meant for the community, but when we look at the tools that are for the beneficiaries, it's very rare that these are developed with them in mind. There's still a lot of communities that don't have access to basic resources, that don't have access to electricity, so you can't really develop an application thinking it's going to work within a given context when they can't even have electricity or water or even a phone maybe to actually access this application. So it's really coming back to the community itself, and thinking about their vulnerabilities, their language, their context, their age, their literacy level. They can have many mobile devices, but don't really know how to use it. So you need to really focus on their needs, their capacities, and try to tailor these approaches and digital technologies to really fit the community. And there are a lot of approaches that are now being seen a bit more, like human-centered design, that really put the user at the forefront and in the middle of the entire design process, talk to them from the first stages to the mid stages to the end stages, and not just gather their feedback when they just promote and put out a technology in place. A great example of a Red Cross society that's doing this is the Swiss Red Cross. They're implementing a mental health question application for the Syrian refugees that have migrated into Switzerland. And they really built the application from start with their context in specific. What are their needs? What are the questions that they're looking at? within the Swiss context, but also developing the application in Arabic, which is their native language, which also we see a lot of cases where we're developing things in English because that's the international way of doing things. But once you're really developing it within the context in mind, it completely shifts the gear and you're really putting that user in perspective and really having him at the heart and center of the entire design process. But yeah, with that in mind, so these are some approaches that could be taken into account to really improve the technology that's being put out there, that's being used by the humanitarian sector, specifically when we want it and intend for it to be used by the communities for their benefit. So we might as well actually use these communities and talk to them. But also within the digital divide, it's not just about the communities and being inclusive with them, but it's also taking a look at the organizations themselves. Within one organization, in one country, there's still a digital gap between that same organization. So the Red Cross work at headquarter level, but they also work at branches within different regions of that particular country. And we are seeing still that there's such a great digital gap between what headquarters have access to, their capacities, their skills, and those at the branch level. Even though we're in the same context, the gap is still major, and we're trying to reduce that gap by either promoting literacy, training specific users on technology, or making sure that the technology that is being used within these branches that are a bit more rural are actually needed and are actually useful for these branches. So it's not just the gap and inclusivity between the community and the organization, but even within an organization, there's still such a big gap that needs to be addressed.
That's a really good point. I'm thinking of some research that I was involved in about 5 years ago, and we found that there was a much bigger digital divide within countries between urban and rural than there was between this country and that country. So it was much more localized in terms of digital capacity, digital divide, and digital literacy. Simone, you have some figures to illustrate the digital divide that you brought along today.
Yes, definitely. Digital illiteracy affects 17% of the French population. Just one example. The main causes are social, regional, and generational. 57% of the world population has access to internet, and 45% has a social media profile. Only 12% in sub-Saharan Africa has access to internet. The internet is 50 times faster in Singapore than in Algeria. When you design a new website, a new app, eco-design makes easier the access to the right information and helps to display data in a low network connection.
Pretty interesting statistics across all parts of the world. And I think COVID and online education really brought a lot of those statistics out really clearly in every country, which were the kids who had access to online education and which kids didn't, and which kids ended up. We had a lot of children and young people in the US, for example, who just were kind of lost from the school system because they couldn't access internet, they didn't have parents staying home to help them with their education, and so a lot of young people ended up just really losing out on education overall because it had gone digital. And so I think it's a worldwide issue, the digital divide. Shadrach, you were saying we should talk about digital divides in the plural. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Melissa and Simone speak right now, you're hearing. We use this term digital divide, but there are so many divides. There are so many different types of gaps, and sort of using the idea that there's only one in our language, I think covers up some of these different gaps that you see between, maybe a low bandwidth eco-friendly solution and a high bandwidth not eco-friendly solution, between the folks in headquarters and the folks at like a country office or a regional office or a local chapter. And some of the divides that I think about in terms of information management and responsible data there's divides that manifest in technology, but they're not necessarily digital divides. Power is a big one of those, right? So according to the General Data Protection Regulation, EU's GDPR, one of the things that you need to get when you're doing sort of data collection in humanitarian space or any sort of data collection is consent. Consent is really important. You can collect data and have other legal basis for doing that, but consent's a big one. But the GDPR states really specifically sort of that it's consent can be problematic if there's some sort of power imbalance. It doesn't phrase it that way in the GDPR, but that's basically what it says. So I think this question comes up then if I work for UNHCR and I go to you and say, hey, I'm taking down all this information about your family, give me all your data. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get the services that I render. Can you really even say that individual is giving consent when they don't, they really don't have an option at that point? So I think that, there are lots of times where, the divide might be in the technology, the divide might be in the process, the divide might be in the application of law. Certainly, technically, there are different types of divides. One question I would have, for my fellow panelists and also for folks who are listening to this is, have you ever tried to request your data from a company? I mean, Melissa just brought up the point, how many of us actually, use cookies, but I'd be really curious about how many of you have tried to perform what's called a data subject access request or a deletion request. And I'd be curious to hear about your experience with that. To give an example, I recently made a data subject request for myself from Amazon. And, Amazon was pretty responsive. I got a response in about a week. But what was that response? I got 48 folders full of different files with names like lightweight value interactions 0.1. I have no idea what that means. I'm someone who's fairly technical. I know how to code. And I looked at this stuff, and it's a mix of file formats. If you're not familiar with JSON, some of these things are in JSON, some of them are in HTML files, some of them are in CSV files. There's no way to really sort through these things easily. 48 folders, hundreds of files. Now, if I'm someone who's been working in technology for 10 or 15 years of work in software development, and I'm at a high bandwidth machine with all these fancy programs, and I'm looking at these things, and I'm really quite lost as to what they mean. I can't really figure out what this data means for me or what it means for Amazon. How would I expect, someone who isn't privileged enough to have that experience or those tools at their disposal? So when I think about kind of getting back to this question about being sober, and in the interpretation from a more Anglophone perspective, I think it's really important to think about all these digital divides, the plural, and to try and see these things clearly, and to start to, unless you acknowledge that there's a problem, you can't deal with the problem, right? The first part is acknowledging there's an issue here. So I think that naming these divides, these different types of divides that we have, is really important. And when we look back, I know for myself, just speaking for myself, 10, 15 years ago, when I thought about the digital divide, my primary concern was, everybody needs a smartphone, everybody needs an internet connection, But as Simon's very, correctly showing us, look, not only does this still exist, even though we thought that was a problem, but now by trying to take that approach of just making everyone's data available all the time, we've introduced these other problems and some of these other divides. So that's my case for thinking that we should speak in plural.
I really like that. So Shadrach has thrown a challenge out to the room. Has anyone tried to get their data before? I have, but I live in a place that doesn't have any data privacy law at the overall level, which also you do, Shadrach. So we don't have the kinds of protections that folks in Europe have through the GDPR, but has anyone done a data subject access request? Raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. No one.
It's very instructive. I think it's a good thing for everyone to try and see what it's like.
I quit Facebook maybe COVID time warp, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I can't remember. And I requested my files several times, and I think on the 6th or 7th time, they actually sent them to me, and it was very similar. It was a bunch of folders. I was finally able to figure out which ones were photographs, but I didn't know what any of the other stuff was. And I've requested a couple of organizations to take me off their list and take me out of their database, and that definitely confuses customer service representatives because they don't really know what you're talking about most of the time. If you say data, if you say take me off your mailing list, they understand that, but I don't think they really know what you mean when you say take me out of your database, stop processing my data. So anyway, I guess challenge for everybody to try when you go home. Pick your worst company or the best company and ask them to stop collecting your data. Or maybe try a social service. Try a hospital, try a school system. It would be quite interesting to see if they have capacity to respond. Yeah. So any other digital divides that people have been thinking about through this conversation that you want to mention? Maeve?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. One I would like to mention that's been, I mean, the digital divide that Melissa and Shadrach mentioned, I thought were very interesting. But inside an organization, I feel one thing we haven't talked about is the digital divide between the sort of geek IM people who are going to be very around like quantitative data, and in terms of quantity of data collected, can sometimes be a bit too enthusiastic. And more the thematic side, where you will have people who are not very geeky, want to have as little as possible with data as they wish, and perhaps also consider themselves as not being data people, even though they are by default because they don't have a choice. And maybe that's something that I would like to put to the speakers. I mean, what do you do for this type of divide in terms of digital and data literacy to try and make sure that inside an organization you aren't pulling towards non-sober practices just because it's the wrong people that master the data and feel that the data is their own data.
I would love to tell you that I am one of these people that is not a data person who works on data and digital literacy. So my background's in public health, but I've worked in the humanitarian sector. So my initial start with it was with more qualitative, thematic, really talking to the people and finding out what these domains are rather than looking at the numbers. But a great way I would recommend, and what we try to do when we are interacting with these organizations, is to really understand the skill scoping within the organization. So there are going to be those great nerds that can do amazing work, but there's also going to be those people that really know how to interact with the community, really know how to apply community engagement and accountability practices. And it's about identifying those skills and encouraging them that they can then be pioneers within the organization to kind of bridge that gap between the different teams and the departments. So it's not just about how you're bridging it with the community and really having allocated focuses within those teams to either just focus on the data and do the tech part, or just people only talking to the community, but learning from each other and having these shared experiences where you're understanding how the tech and more experts in that area are also learning from people that do CEA and use these toolkits and engage with the communities, because at the end they're also creating for the community, so they need to be able to acknowledge these skills as well, and then it goes a bit vice versa. So it's more about skill scoping, understanding, learning, and being able to share openly within the organization on how you can kind of combine these efforts together. But yes, I am very much a non-data person, but now I feel that I own the title to say that I'm a bit of a data person at the moment.
Fantastic. You know, as other was me, I was thinking about the age divide. I think that's a really critical one as folks get older. Maybe they can't see their phone as well. Maybe their fingers aren't working as well as they used to. They can't type as easily on a small screen. Maybe they don't see as well. So we have, you know, or just even comprehension of how data and technology work. I'm definitely not somebody that's probably ever going to go into the metaverse because I'm past my prime. Not going to the metaverse. I'm going to stay here with, you know, smartphones and the internet. You know, but maybe the 5 and 6-year-olds are going to be, you know, light years ahead of us in this metaverse that's happening out there. And, you know, we have this saying that people say, "Hey, boomer," in the U.S. when you're slightly older and you don't know how technology works. And so it's going to be "Hey, Gen X" pretty soon, I think. But Simon, and we've been talking a lot about these digital divides, but I wanted to return back to this point around the environmental impacts of data and tech, and thinking that, you know, maybe tech isn't so great for the environment as we initially thought it was. I hear a lot about blockchain, and that blockchain is not a good idea because of the huge environmental impacts that mining has. But there are other kinds of tech tools that you're thinking about quite a lot in this area. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
I would have said that the first question is, what are we talking about when we are speaking about the environmental impact of IT? So currently, the environmental impact of digital technologies represent 4% of the global greenhouse gases, and could be over 10% in 2030 if we keep going the current way. We have to understand that to build up this kind of smartphone, it requires more than 200 kilos of raw material and more than 100,000 liters of water. A laptop is at least 5 times worse, and making a server is maybe more than 20 times. So 20 times worse. So just to sum up, digital requires massive resources. The thing is, the world resources are not limitless. So that's why we are talking about sobriety. So we have to think in a limited world, not unlimited world. The main sources of digital environment footprint are hardware production. So when we build a smartphone, laptop, server, etc. Network and infrastructure, when we are talking about 4G, 5G, etc., and everything to get your Wi-Fi at home, for example. And the last part is the data use and software. So now I think it's important to know that we can all act as citizen, as employer, and as employee to go to sobriety. So I think I'm gonna share with you some tips, some good tips, always. The first one is just to wake up and to be aware about this challenge we are facing currently. Because if you don't know, you don't do. So it's quite simple. So if you know, you can do. The first one is to try to extend the life of all your equipment. So it means you can refurbish, you can recycle, you can reuse, you can get second hands. You can choose technical spec to reduce the planned obsolescence. It's another topic, but planned obsolescence make us not able to use a smartphone or laptop after maybe for three years, for example. But actually, my laptop has something like 9 years old, and it's still working very well, just because I've chose it with very good spec at the beginning. So yeah, it was more expensive, but you can keep it longer. About data, and actually, I just wanted to go back to something, because when we are talking about equipment, finally, the first thing to do is just to take care of it. If you take care of your equipment, your smartphone, etc., you will like to keep it longer. When we are talking about equipment, data, etc., we just have to very think that actually we just need to use only what we need, or the opposite. So that's really important, just to focus on. It was the first question 30 minutes ago. We actually, yeah. Why don't we use only what we need, actually? Shut down what you are not using. Avoid 4G, 5G, because the footprint is 20 times worse than Wi-Fi. Watching video in a lower quality, because it can divide your footprint by 20 between, for example, AG and SD. A video is 80% of the web bandwidth. Favor eco-design website and app. So when you eco-design a website or an app, you can divide by 100 the footprint. Favor green hosting solution with renewable energy, no climatization, refurbished servers. It can reduce by 10 in Europe and 70 compared to some other countries in the world. Change screens sometimes to video projector. That's a good idea. Like this one, for example, we can better see shadow. It's a good idea. And the last one would be just don't print, because when we are talking about sustainable IT, we are talking about printing solution. So don't print, and if you have to print, use recycled paper and eco font. You can use some font that can have just reduce your impact by but to 25%. So it's quite interesting. Thank you.
I didn't prep you for the follow-up question, but I have a follow-up question, and sort of what can we do to kind of advocate for manufacturers and private sector to also play the right role in reducing the environmental footprint of tools and technologies?
Yeah, actually, when you manufacture an equipment, you can try to recycle a lot of components. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you just have to be more responsible about where you get your raw materials. I didn't say that, but actually behind any electronic equipment, in any smartphone like this, you have some raw material like coltan, and to get some coltan, you need kids to go into very narrow mines. So we have to keep that in mind when we use this kind of equipment. It means some kids worked on it. So that's important, and that's why we need to push some manufacturers and some big companies to change that from the inside.
Thank you. Melissa, do you have anything to add on this topic?
I'm no expert, obviously, in this particular field, but kind of in line with what you said, and really talk and focus about the context and what do you actually need. You might not need 6 screens in one emergency center when you can just use one big screen or a projector even. I know even on a personal level, a lot of friends have been shifting to buying projectors for their personal use instead of just buying really big TVs and big screens. But also to touch base back on initially what I was saying is be more purpose-driven. So of course, focusing on what you really need, what the capacities are, but be very mindful of the purpose. So do you really need to collect all this data? Do you really need to store all this data? For how long do you really need to store it? So all of these questions kind of fall back into the minimization of data initially and focusing on the purpose itself. And then kind of the last point when we're looking at a bigger and wider data management process, really having in place and taking into consideration archiving data and project closure, because a lot of the times we also face the facts and the realities that data sets are just stored forever, 10, 20 years. No one knows what they're used for. But then you also run the risk, of course, that people might be able to access them. They might have sensitive or personal data. So really taking into consideration these measures of knowing, okay, this is the lifetime of the project. This is what we're archiving. This is what we're going to get rid of, so that you're not just keeping these servers running because they're storing a large amount of data sets for years and years to come. So these are just a bit of my points.
It sounds like we really need to shift the narrative again, because I remember just hearing several years ago, oh, like storage is so cheap and you can save everything for however long you want, it doesn't cost anything. And as usual, we think it doesn't cost any money, but we don't think about the environmental impacts and the potential risks for data that we're storing for that long. And Shadrach, you brought up when we talked earlier the point around e-waste, and I know a lot of e-waste is, like a lot of waste from Europe and the US is kind of shipped out to other countries to deal with. And I don't really have any sense, how much e-waste do we create in the humanitarian sector? Are we sober with our acquisition of tools, or are we extravagant?
It's a great question, and I don't know myself. I have a few anecdotes, but one of the reasons I've really appreciated being on this panel was to hear from Simon, because it's something I haven't really thought about before, and I almost feel like what I'm hearing is, with physical, like paper and analog things, we went through this transition in our language where we would say, well, you can throw it away. And then there was a group of people that came along and said, there's no such thing as away. It doesn't go away. It's here with us. So we need to think about recycling or using less or whatever. And as you've just said, we've had this dialogue for a long time, or this kind of idea that, it's digital, so you can just, now that's sort of the new away. You can just put it there. But you listen to these facts and figures, and it's really staggering, actually. And I've started to wonder about that a lot. I can give one example. At Mercy Corps, when we get laptops, so the laptop I'm speaking to you now on, there was a program that if I decided to leave Mercy Corps, they would, they would go through a security process and wipe this laptop off and scrub all the data from it. But then they would offer it to me, and they would say, you can buy this really cheaply for like $100, $200, something like that. And the reason they were doing that was because otherwise I take this laptop, I'm a remote worker, I have to send it back to them, so there's carbon there in its shipping. They get it, and then we do a lot of work to try and make sure that we responsibly recycle all of our electronics at Mercy Corps. But then it still has to go through that process. And they would rather kind of say, well, if you can, if you can still use this thing, why don't we just charge you a nominal fee and then you just keep using it? And that program actually got discontinued. And me and some of the other folks in procurement were talking about it, and we're not sure why, because it seemed like a good program. So I think about that a lot. We're going through a process right now where we're trying to shift from one email provider to another. And part of that process is we're telling everyone, hey, all those emails you have in your current inbox from 10 years ago, and all those attachments and all those files, like, we probably don't really need to keep those when we migrate to this new system. So maybe we should get rid of those. And we haven't found a good way to really talk about the carbon footprint of that yet. And in part, I think because so many of us just aren't aware of it. So, Simon, as you said, you have to wake up. And I feel like personally, I'm just now kind of waking up to this. And I'm curious if there have been studies or if there has been work done to try and understand e-waste specifically in the humanitarian sector or the carbon footprint of the humanitarian sector. Does anything like that exist? I'm just curious if there is any known study, because my guess is that it's high and that it's an audience that might be amenable to reducing that, but I just don't know.
No, I don't know. Okay. Simon says he doesn't know. I know that the Engine Room just did a report around the environment. I haven't seen it yet, but I know that that's out there. I don't know, maybe you know more about that report. But I think one of the interesting things to think about when we go into, the ideas around e-waste and around the amounts of energy that some countries use and other countries don't, and the places where e-waste gets thrown when it's no longer wanted. I think in the same way we think about differential impacts of, other types of disasters, I think we can assume that most of these challenges are hitting poor countries, are hitting, they're being sort of disposed of in places that people in wealthier countries aren't really going to think about because it's not coming to our backyard most of the time. Or if it is, it's being, dumped in poor communities in our backyards or, where we don't see it. So I think the differential impacts of these environmental issues with technology are something that we should definitely be thinking about in the humanitarian space and in the development space, and outside of it as well. So that's just some thoughts I have. I don't know, again, we want to throw it back out to folks in the room, folks online. If anyone has any thoughts or comments, any suggestions of other ways to think about this, other solutions or things we could join into, would love to hear. Maybe you've got some online stuff.
Yeah, we have one online question from Christophe Agnès, and there's another question on the room on a related question. It's around sustainable hardware and in particular around smartphones. So the question from online was around Fairphone, so the brand that is more environmentally oriented in terms of the minerals that are used and the whole chain to build the software, the hardware rather. So does that help move the boundaries? And I'll just hand over to Lisa, who had a related question or comment.
Thanks. Thank you very much for all these tips. I think it's always good to remember what the most important actions are to reduce your footprint. But yeah, sometimes I get lost because it doesn't seem realistic at all to me that my logistic department buys in 30 refurbished computers for the NGO. I can apply it to my personal use quite easily most of the time. But yeah, I wonder if it's realistic. I wonder if at some point in the middle of, in Ukraine, we're going to ask ourselves, okay, can we buy Fairphone for this survey? Or maybe we can't even use phones, so we're going to print out our 380 questionnaires. Oh, is it a good idea for the environment? Well, I don't think at this moment you're really able to ask yourself that. So yeah, I get a little bit lost.
I don't know, Simon, do you have any thoughts around Fairphone? I don't know. I know I've heard of it, but I don't know a whole lot about if it still even exists.
Yeah, Fairphone is a great idea, clearly, because they really pay attention to every raw materials they are using, and you can repair them very easily. So that's very interesting, yeah. And about this fact globally, the last thing I'm always saying to organization and collectivities is that when you try to set up a sustainable strategy in your organization, you will save a lot of money, and you will take all your employees into a great environmental project. And so it's pretty good for the global emulation of your company. So it's totally positive.
You're just making me think a lot about the fact that, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if there would be anybody in this room today or anyone at this conference who works in the procurement department of their organization. Anybody work on procurement?
No, we just have the geeks here with us.
So, I mean, are there conferences of procurement people that get together and talk about the importance of the environment in their procurement? I don't know. I have no idea, because I'm also not in procurement. But I feel like a lot of times when I come to conferences like this, where the tech people are here, or the program people are over here, and they don't even talk to each other half the time, and they don't talk to the protection people and the safeguarding people and the gender people. Anyway, so I'm just wondering. I'm thinking, as you said, like, we can all do so much in our own personal lives, and it's a drop in the bucket until, large organizations, large manufacturers, until it's kind of a global movement that hits at the much bigger players. And I know everybody knows this, and I'm preaching to the choir, but those are the things that I feel sometimes frustrated around too, is, how do we get everybody on board, and how do we go after the big players? And I guess I don't know if anyone has that answer. I keep looking at you, Simone, because you seem like you know the most about it here today.
I think it's why the European Sustainable IT Institute does exist. It's clearly to talk to large organizations and to spread this kind of message. Shadok just say, okay, we totally need to wake up, and I totally agree about that. So this is why when we are working in this sustainable IT area, we always say that we really need to make visible the invisible. So that's why I'm here today, and that's why I like to speak about that, because the first step, it's clearly to get awareness.
I'm just thinking about, even if it were small steps, which I know we don't like incremental change, but sometimes, what if it were a percentage of equipment every year that we had a goal, we would buy 10% refurbished equipment this year, and then next year 20%, I don't know, something like that. Is that something that you've seen work? I mean, what are the kinds of goals that organizations can set for themselves on some of these things?
Yeah, you can do this. And actually, when you extend the life of all equipment, you have to think differently. Just to say, okay, if we buy something new, and you can buy sometimes some new equipment, but don't plan to keep it just 3 years. Plan to keep it for 8 years. So the first 2 years, it will be for Peter, and then to David, etc., etc. And between all of them, you can refurbish it, and you can maybe upgrade it a little bit. But you have to plan this at the beginning. And when you buy something new, don't buy anything like discount equipment. You have to buy something with very good technical specs. It's very important, because if in 2022, like now, you have a good MacBook with more than 16 GB RAM on it, you can almost do whatever you do. But if you chose it with only 4 GB of RAM previously, now you can just do nothing with it. And actually, Apple made Big Sur. It was a new OS, so exploitation system, and it was made to kill every 4 GB of RAM computers. So we have to really pay attention to that. So that's why we are working against planned obsolescence.
Thank you. That's all so important. Yeah. Okay, I see we're almost towards the end, and one thing that we wanted to do was share out today some resources and tools that we're using, or in some cases have created, to help people be more sober with data. And we've talked about a whole range of sobriety issues with data. We've talked about the environment. We've talked about sort of everything from storing data on servers that take up a lot of energy to production of technology tools to collection and over-collection of data that can then be harmful because both we're storing it and it's bad for the environment, but we're also putting a lot of people at risk because we've got a whole bunch of their data sitting somewhere and not being used. So we've covered kind of a lot of ground, but what are some of the tools that your organizations or you yourselves have created or you work with or you use to kind of guide you in your journey towards sobriety with your data and your information and your technology? I guess let's start with you, Melissa.
Well, for myself, specifically under the spectrum of literacy, I've worked on a toolkit that maybe some of you have heard of, but it's called the Data Playbook. There's a new version out now. And it's really a toolkit that has resources of over 120 materials, exercises, scenarios, games, handouts that can help facilitators within organizations really start the conversation on literacy. So what does data mean? Why does it matter? How does it affect decision making? How can we start talking about strengthening teams within our organization? And also some components of the typical data process. So focusing on data collection, how do we know that if we're making a bad survey or not? How do we take into consideration data protection? So there's a wide range of examples and exercises that was really built by the Red Cross community, initially for the Red Cross community, but is now extended to other humanitarian organizations that have also been applying different data literacy programs and are interested in implementing the methodology that we're able to use in a network-centered approach and participatory approach within developing this toolkit. So it's a really great resource, I'm biased, but it's been used now, and it's being used more by other Red Cross societies to really start these conversations in a very engaging and simple way without diving into the tech automatically. And it's really nice to see how different communities interact with the exercises because they need to take a step back, reflect on a component or a topic in a very different mindset than just looking at huge data sets and trying to understand how this meets their organization's need. So this is one main toolkit that I've been a part of and now kind of implementing with different Red Cross societies to see how can we improve it. And it's going to be also available on GitHub for like constant update, constant improvement. It's being translated to different languages, so we really hope to try to see the most out of it and try to adapt it as much as we can in the next coming years.
And so if somebody Googles Data Playbook, they'll find it, right?
Yes. It's
Okay.
supposed to be on the Prepared Center, and if you can't find me, I'll link you to it automatically.
Fantastic. Shadrach, you've also been working on some data protection tools and guides.
Yeah, and just to underscore what Melissa's saying, the Data Playbook is a great resource. We use it, we reference it. I think, I'm not sure if it was Maeve or someone else in the audience asked earlier about the divide between, sort of the really technical quant people and qualitative, more programmatic folks. A lot of the exercises in the playbook help bring everybody to the table to get a shared understanding of data, technology, information management. So I can't speak highly enough of it. The team there really has been working a long time and done great work. So we appreciate that. That was actually an inspiration for what we have done at Mercy Corps this year. And that was that we wanted to bridge this divide a little bit. I work in an IT department now. It's the first time I've worked in an IT department. I have normally been in programmatic offices. So there is a little bit of a cultural divide there. but we wanted to make sure that use of technology and information management and data wasn't too mysterious. And we were hearing from a lot of our country offices that they wanted simple things, they needed instructions, they needed very clear instructions about how to do things. A lot of what we talk about, I mean, even today to a certain extent, is pretty high level. And people want concrete, like, tell me how I can protect my data, tell me how I can reduce the number of attachments I send. They want tools, they want clear guidance on that. So at Mercy Corps, we created a set of data protection and privacy guides. There are 5 guides, so each one covers a specific topic. Some of these are very sort of data protection oriented, de-identification, doing privacy impact assessments. Some of them are more information management oriented, best practices around file sharing, things like that. And each guide we've created in 6 languages. So we've got them available in French, Spanish, English, Russian, Ukrainian, and Arabic. And same if you do a web search and you look for Mercy Corps data protection guides, you'll find them. We've released them in sort of branded, nicely designed PDFs. There's also a video. The videos are English only, but they accompany the PDFs for people that might want to are better audio learners or are going to be better at just hearing someone speak. And then all of the material, the content, the raw content is available. We have a GitHub repository as well, where it's unbranded, so it's all the same material. You can go there, you can download it all, you can repurpose it, you can rebrand it, use it for your own organization. It's specifically made available under open license. And we have a community call coming up probably in November, where we're trying to meet with different stakeholders to find out how we can, or if we should, continue to maintain this resource in the commons, as a public good. How can people contribute sort of more ideas or tools or methodologies to us? Do people want to see different translations? What aspects of that can Mercy Corps fund and help with? What other aspects are other people willing to manage or willing to be part of? So a lot of our kind of reporting right now, we just got done with a community report that kind of tell people how the first 6 months went since we released these, is done through the Engine Room and Responsible Data Forum. Again, you can look those up online. So if you're interested in the community call, if you're interested in the guides, you should be able to find them easily enough. If not, as Melissa said, just come contact me and I'll do my best to connect you to them as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Chadwick. I was also going to mention the Responsible Data listserv that the Engine Room runs, which is a great place for just asking questions. Does anybody know about this? Has anybody thought about that? How are people doing this? Really great forum. And you can find that, I think it's responsibledata.io. Or you can go to the Engine Room. There are 2 Engine Rooms, though. One of them is a private sector something or other, and then one of them is more of a human rights and data and responsible data site. I'll offer out MERLTech.org has a lot of resources. We try to compile resources across from data, from monitoring and evaluation, and we kind of have a responsible focus on everything. So I guess responsible is similar to sober. You have to be more responsible, more measured in the way that we use data and the way that we use tools for monitoring and evaluation, the amounts of data that we collect when we do monitoring and evaluation, research and learning. So that's at merltech.org. And then we'll close out with resources from Simon. It's a slightly different track than the 3 of us, but much appreciated to learn from you about some resources or institutes, or where do you go to learn about environmental aspects of technology and sobriety.
Yes, thank you. And actually, I think I'm going to be more global than you and speak about digital sobriety. So for me, the first tool is maybe ourselves. We need some ears to get awareness. We need a mouth to spread a good message. And we need a head to always maybe ask this question, do I really need it? And it works for anything when we are talking about consumption. Then if you want to act and you want to go ahead, my first advice would be maybe you can join the European Sustainable IT Institute, because you have some tools, some databases, etc. So, and some skills inside the institute to get awareness and to know what you do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to work on a global sustainable IT strategy. So we were talking about, okay, what we can do. So you have to write it down, black on white, to make sure all employees and all the organization is going ahead through this. So I'm doing this is one part of my job, but mainly what I can advise you is really to set up a strategy, and you have to keep in mind, like, what can we do just to be more sober. Sometimes it's you have to measure at the beginning, like your IT footprint. And I really advise you to do it. Like, if you measure at the beginning and you set up some objective, you can work to reach those targets. And that's maybe more tangible and interesting. It's really like a challenge for any organization, any companies. And anyway, it's maybe more global because it's a challenge for all human on Earth. And thank you.
Thank you so much. So if we can take maybe a couple questions or comments from all of you. Going once, going twice, going once. There we go.
I have a question. So my question is, you speak about website eco-design. And I would like to know if you have more detail on it, or advice, tips to do some good eco-design.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your question. When we speak about eco-design, we are speaking about actually four things. The first one is the way you're doing your user experience inside your website. So you have to make it shorter, etc., etc. The second one is about the UX and UI. So how you set up an interface to make sure it's require less resources, for example, for users to reach an information, to do something, but also to make your website like, for example, we used to advise to set up a dark mode when you do eco-design, because it requires less pixels when you use it. The third part is about green coding, so the way you really set up your website. So it's the same as sobriety, just use code you need for your website. You don't, sometimes when you set up a website with a theme already made, etc., you only use 5% of your website. The rest is only for nothing. And the fourth thing is really about green hosting, because if you do an eco-design website and you host it on a green hosting solution, it will divide maybe by more than 10 your global footprint. Thank you.
Great. Mm-hmm. There's one more question over here.
It's also an answer to the two previous questions in a way, because there's another great resource that I would like to highlight that is could be a fifth point, Simon. I don't know if you would agree. Resource that's done by MIT. A study that's called Don't Build It. And it's more in terms of tech minimization, thinking through when you really need technology or not, and making sure that you're not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, and truly, actually, when you speak about eco-design, it's really like minimalism. So you just focus on the main feature. you just avoid, if you're not sure about something, like, okay, I want to set up a website, but I have one main feature and I have 9 other ones, but not sure people will use them. So just don't set them up. Maybe you can go step by step and do something like test and learn and go ahead.
And I really love that from the development perspective, because one of the principles that we always have is, figure out what's there first. Don't create parallel systems. Don't create parallel networks. Don't, work locally, work sustainably, work with what's already there, and it's, on top of going to be more environmentally sustainable, it's going to cost less money, and it's probably going to work better. So I think those are really compatible thought processes. Yeah. One more question, I think.
Yeah, there was a question from online on whether renting out hardware, if I'm not mistaken, could be also an interesting solution, and if anybody, some of our speakers have interesting experiences on this. Again, it could be more for procurement type teams, but...
It could be, and it could not be. So it really depends on the supplier. It depends what they are doing and how they get the equipment you can rent. So it really depends the supplier.
I mean, I can say from the monitoring and evaluation side, I know of organizations that will have a set of tablets, and when they do data collection, it's that same set of tablets, which first it allows the tablets to be reused and reused and reused, but it also means that you can put security features on the tablets. You can make your data collection much more secure because it's within your enterprise system. You can do remote wipe on things. So I don't know if the people who are doing the data collection love having to get a new device and a new system every single time. But that's one way that I know some organizations take care of the reuse of the hardware and also improve security. I don't know, Shadrach, if you have anything to add on that one.
Not really. We've got a suite of software that we use, but each country office handles their own hardware. So I think that's something interesting to look into. I've learned an awful lot to think about from this conversation. So it's definitely something I can follow up on.
Melissa, do you have a way you do that? No. Okay, great. All right, we're right at time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in the room today and online. Thanks to Melissa and Simon and Shadrach. I also learned a ton today, and thanks, Maeve, and everybody who was involved in organizing. We're happy to be here and happy to have shared what we know and what we're thinking about with all of you today.